Elena experienced a lot of heartbreak.
She wanted a family unit. She wanted a husband or a partner.
Brandon definitely appeared to have fallen for Elena.
Hello, Brandon.
Hi, Elena. How are you?
I noticed my mom becoming increasingly isolated from everybody else.
He was very good at putting up an act.
Elena was walking on eggshells. Anything ticked him off.
Brandon made that decision with her kids in the next room.
Where's she at?
The interviewer asked him to draw pictures of what he saw.
I'm really happy with my life and where it's going.
Me too.
It's Brandon.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Who's watching right now?
I don't know, I can't see.
It's 2018, and 32-year-old Elena Wysong and her husband Brandon spend the day at Virginia Beach.
My mom was very kind and loving. She had had her fair share of bad relationships. So I think that when she did find Brandon, she definitely thought that, you know, this was the guy that she was going to be with for the rest of her life.
That's Daddy's little girl. Say hi, Daddy. 2 years old, too.
Elena was born October 22nd, 1985. She was very, very, very healthy, happy baby. Elena had 2 older brothers. My oldest son was Robert, and my youngest son was Darren. They were kind of thrilled when she joined the family. She was like a doll to them.
2 years later, the family get another addition.
We lived in Staten Island, New York. Elena was actually somebody I considered like a hero at the time, somebody I could look up to, and I admired her greatly.
Looking at me? And to me, love boy. Tomorrow.
In August 2000, when Elena is 14, the Arena family moved to Chesapeake, Virginia.
When Elena's hormones kicked in, I think they kicked in full blast. Elena fell in love, and she got pregnant when she was 17.
On October 9th, 2003, just 13 days before her 18th birthday, Elena gives birth to a baby girl she names Natalie.
It meant the world to Elena just being a mom and just trying to be the best mom that she could be.
But the relationship with Natalie's father doesn't last.
They were just too young. Elena was upset. She wanted a family unit. She wanted a husband or a partner.
In 2005, Elena starts dating someone new.
A year after they started dating, Elena got pregnant, and Angel was born on August 22nd, 2007.
But when Angel is just 2 years old, Elena and her father split.
It affected Elena pretty badly because she really wanted to end up keeping the whole family unit together, and I know she tried her hardest to make it work.
In 2013, Elena and her daughters, now 10 and 6, moved to an apartment in Virginia Beach.
Things started looking up for my mom. She became vegan, she became very spiritual. It was a very happy time.
In August that year, 27-year-old Elena meets 24-year-old Brandon Wysong through mutual friends.
It's Brandon.
Hey, what's up, everybody?
At the time, Brandon was a construction worker.
Hello, Brandon.
Hi, Elena. How are you?
My mom definitely seemed to fall very quickly in love with him.
He was extremely attentive with her and very loving.
Within 3 months of meeting, Elena and Brandon are engaged and living together.
Brandon had a son around the same age as Angel.
I was pretty excited. He had a kid of his own, and my mom had 2 kids, and we were very excited to just be one big family. I don't think I had seen my mom this happy in a while. He seemed to be very good for her. My sister liked him a lot. My mom's friends seemed to like him a lot. My grandma liked him a lot. So I was hopeful for it.
In the fall of 2013, Elena attends a Buddhist ceremony.
My mom was very involved in Buddhism, and she practiced it daily. Brandon definitely did seem like this very supportive man for my mom. He was very invested in her religion and her spiritual journey. It seemed like he was going to be this super awesome, great stepdad. Brandon would take us to the beach a lot. He'd buy us, ice cream on the boardwalk and pizza for dinner while my mom was at work.
Where's the capital of New Jersey? Outside.
Brandon was a really big part of Angel's life, a very big father figure for her. He'd do just about anything for her.
At the end of 2013, just 4 months into their relationship, Elena discovers she is pregnant.
Elena was extremely excited. She was all ready to have another little one back in the house.
My mom was very much a family person, and I think that them having a baby together kind of just brought the families together.
Elena and Brandon tie the knot in a courthouse in Virginia Beach.
A few months after my mom and Brandon got married, Brandon had an accident at work that completely crushed his leg. He was not able to work anymore. My mom was very stressed out. She was freaking out, trying to figure out how they were going to get money now, how they're going to make rent, and, how they're going to put food on the table.
The family are forced to move into a cheaper home, and in August 2014, Elena gives birth to a son named Bobby.
He's the most beautiful baby in the world.
Yes, yes.
I love you, Robert Anthony.
I do.
When Bobby was born, me, Angel, Brandon's son, Brandon, and my mom were all living in the house. Everything was pretty good when we brought Bobby back home from the hospital. Everybody seemed to be in good spirits.
I can eat you up. As a matter of fact, I think I'm going.
Brandon was really excited, especially to have another son.
Bobby was 3 months old when Elena fell pregnant again. I think she was in shock. It was going to be a lot of work to have like a 1-year-old and then a newborn.
Shortly after, Natalie shares some news with her mom.
When I was about 12 or 13, I came out to my mom as trans. My mom was very supportive, and she had picked out the name Nathan Andrew Nabel, and that's just kind of what stuck. I noticed that Brandon had started to change a few weeks after Bobby was born. Brandon had surgery on his leg, and he was kind of a little more mad than usual. He just seemed very irritated, even at the smallest things.
Laura was born on September 28th, 2015.
Good morning.
At this point, Elena and Brandon had just been together for about 2 years, and now they had 2 children who were very close in age.
My baby. Oh, you love that, Bubba? Oh.
Brandon seemed to be a lot more agitated, more on edge. A lot of the smaller things seemed to bother him a lot more than they usually did. When Alora was about a month old, my mom and Brandon had gone into an argument in front of all of us, and he had thrown a chair. That chair had hit Alora's bassinet. That was the first time I had seen him get aggressive. That was the start.
Alora, what are you doing on Daddy's wallet?
Alora, what's that in your hand? Yay!
Brandon was under the impression that because of the accident, he was going to make a huge amount of a settlement. That did not happen.
Bitcoin.
I know, but whose Bitcoin is that?
It's Bitcoin.
Is it? Show the camera.
He would sell business classes to people on how to make a bunch of money through Bitcoin. He'd find like images off of Google of like money spreads on the table, and he'd post it and be like, look how much money I'm making. Like, you can make this money too.
When Brandon's new business venture isn't delivering, Elena steps in to try and help.
My mom and Brandon were arguing frequently about sales and how much money they were making.
He was very irritable at times.
What? Alora, I told you I can't get to the store.
There was a lot of things going on that he just kind of dumped on Elena. And I think things started to unravel even faster between the two of them.
They had had some type of argument, and my mom had asked me to go from, just go to pick up the kids and to pick up my sister and bring them back to the house. So I went and took the car to go pick everyone up except for my sister. She decided to stay at the house and kind of decompress. I brought the kids back to my mother's house, and I took Brandon to go see his friend that lived in a different city. And while we were on the way there, he started to get really paranoid and angry. He started actually using his fists to hit into the dashboard of my car and started threatening my sister. He started threatening he was going to kill her. So I gave him an ultimatum. Either I was going to turn him into the cops or he had to get out of my car right away. And he chose to get out of the car. That's when I really started to see the real person that he was, which was this angry, violent, and dangerous person.
Brandon's temper escalates, and by the summer of 2017, Elena becomes deeply depressed.
When I was about 14, I noticed my mom becoming increasingly isolated from everybody else. It was kind of hard for her to do a lot of stuff around the house. We didn't really go out anywhere.
Elena was walking on eggshells because anything ticked him off. She would do anything just to keep him, happy so he would not start with her. Elena was desperately trying to keep the family together, even though Brandon was really making it fall apart.
Okay, there he is.
On social media, Elena portrays Brandon to be a perfect husband and father.
You ready? Are you ready? 1, 2, 3!
Wow, how the universe blessed me with such a great little boy, a big brother, a nurturer, and a protector to these two.
I do think that she just did ignore a lot of the abuse because, for the most part, he was very good at putting up an act. I think she was ashamed to let anybody know what was really going on and how hard she was struggling just to keep her family together.
Despite the issues in her marriage, Elena makes time for her children whenever she can.
This is when my mom took me to my first Pride. We had walked around for a bit, and my mom had bought me my first pride flag. She had danced around with me and Alora. And I remember that at the end of the day, me, her, and Alora had all sat down on the grass, and it was just happy. There was no stress. There was no Brandon ruining the moment. It was just me, my mom, and Alora, and it felt great.
In the summer of 2018, Linda invites Elena and her family to Florida.
When they arrived, the kids got ready and they went to the pool. And some type of an incident happened at the pool where Brandon struck Bobby. And the children were very upset. The kids came back and they told their mother, and of course, she was very upset. She was telling him off, you know, why are you hitting him? Why are you putting your hands on him? Brandon was angry. He went outside. He called someone on the phone, screaming and yelling. I was extremely concerned. I said, Elena, this is a bad situation. You need to get out of this situation. I told her that I would get her an apartment. She just couldn't tell him where she lived. If he wanted to see the children, it would have to be at my house. And she wanted to do it, and then she was afraid. She said, you know, I don't want the kids to grow up without a father. She wanted them to be together. She was trying to make it better, even as it was falling apart.
6 months later, Elena calls her mom.
Brandon had actually smashed the window of the family car and slashed the tires. So I volunteered to go over there, and the police were already there when we arrived. The officers were telling her that they couldn't remove Brandon out of the house. The only way they would be able to do that is if she got a restraining order against him. Elena was devastated. I was going to keep an eye on the kids, and my sister was going to take the car to go get the restraining order. So my sister left shortly after the police. Brandon continued to get more irate, started grabbing the toys and smashing them into pieces on the ground. And then he went to the back porch area and grabbed the machete. I went downstairs and stood in the hallway so he couldn't get upstairs where the children were. He held the machete in his hand. I put him in a bear hug, and he headbutted me.
I hear yelling and screaming coming from downstairs. My siblings are now crying because this is happening literally on the other side of the door. I'm freaking out because I don't know what to do. I don't know what's happening downstairs, and I'm scared if I don't call 911, it'll be too late.
So Nathan called the police, and then I had said to Brandon, this is assault with a deadly weapon. There's something to get him to snap out of it, because I was terrified. I was completely terrified, but I couldn't afford to be terrified because there were children involved. Something I must have said must have snapped in his brain, because he took off with the machete and fled.
So I call 911, and I am crying through the phone call, telling them that my stepfather is hurting my aunt, and I tell them my address. And my mom came back into the house, and she said, they're gonna take Brandon away and he's gonna go to jail. You need to hang up right now.
And then the police arrived. Elena had asked if I would just not say anything because she didn't want the kids to lose their father, and she didn't want to lose her kids to CPS because she wasn't there for the incident. No matter how many times I try to tell her, I'm like, no, this is a good thing, we can get him away. She didn't want to hear it. She just thought that CPS was going to take her kids away. So I chose to remain silent to try to protect my sister. I hated him. I absolutely hated him. And I saw how dangerous and how violent he could end up being. And I tried to warn my family, if we don't let me press charges, he's gonna kill her. He is going to kill her.
Elena is granted a 72-hour emergency protective order.
I hated Brandon. I was just hoping that he just wouldn't come back.
But just 3 days later, Brandon is back in the home.
I was very concerned for Elena. I begged her to move in with me, and she would say yes, and then I guess he would talk to her, tell her things were going to get better, and then she would say, no, things are working out, I'm going to stay here. It was like a cycle.
One night I was spending a night at home and my mom and Brandon had gotten into a pretty big argument. My mom said, I'm gonna take the kids to a hotel for a night. So we all get into our car and she drives us out to the ocean front.
Laura. That's really crazy.
I mean, you're really crazy.
And I remember it was like one of the first times in a long time that I had even seen my mom take a deep breath. So the following day, she gets a phone call, and it's from Brandon. He's just basically saying, you can't take my kids away from me. I'm gonna get you arrested. You need to come back home.
She went back to him the very next day. And I remember talking to her, just, it's okay to start new. And, Mom will help you. We'll do anything to end up helping you to get away from this. But she didn't want to take the kids away from their dad.
Unable to cope with Brandon's violent temper, Nathan spends...
On November 4th, 2019, around 6:34 p.m., we got a call from dispatch letting us know that we had a gunshot wound. The victim was a female, and the suspect was not on scene.
Where's she at?
So immediately as I arrived on scene, I saw 3 younger children running towards me, screaming, she's back there, we need to help her. Started going towards the house. My partner, Officer Wadsworth, was in the back laundry room of the house with the victim and was attempting CPR. It looked like somebody had purposefully uprooted everything in the house onto the floor. And when I got to the door of the laundry room, I could see the victim laying down in a pool of blood with my partner conducting the CPR.
Hey! Right here. Hey, what happened?
So when I went back outside, that's when I made contact with the eldest child, Angel, and I learned that the victim was their mother, Elena Wysong.
Do you know who did this? What's his name? Brandon Wysong? You know what he's wearing?
Brown hair.
Long brown hair.
He's also walking with a limp because he just had knee surgery.
Subject's name is Brandon Wysong, white male, long brown hair. Get more further information.
Do you know what direction he went?
I don't know, sir.
Randy, I saw him running that way, down that alleyway.
Okay. Did you see what happened in there, or you just heard it?
She heard them arguing. You saw her grab on her, headbutted her, and then shot her. We tried to go there, but she was blocking the door. But she seemed unresponsive. He's armed and dangerous, so it was important for us to locate and apprehend him.
My friend and his mom, we pull up to the house. There's like 4 cop cars, and my siblings all 3 of them are in the back of a cop car, and Angel is covered in blood. She's freaking out, and she's crying, and Laura and Bobby are crying. They don't have any clothes on. I could still not grasp what was going on, and it all felt like a dream.
Elena Wysong is pronounced dead at 6:48 p.m.
When we have a possibly armed and dangerous suspect who's fled the scene, it's imperative for us to start tracking that guy down. If they were just able to commit this horrendous act, who knows what they'll do.
At 6:52 p.m., Officer Butler arrives on scene with his canine, Nemo.
Most of the search occurred in a residential area. So just after 7 p.m., a man arrives on scene and identifies himself as Brandon's stepfather. So Brandon's stepfather tells the officer that Brandon wants to turn himself in, and he wants to lead the officers to Brandon himself. So K9 immediately heads to the area, and the dog picks up a scent. Brandon pops up out of the wood line with his hands up.
Attention unit, suspect in custody.
Unit 12, I copy that. Suspect in custody. No more units needed over here with the suspect.
10-4, copy.
I gotta go.
Whenever we arrest someone, we do an immediate search of that person in the waist area, and Brandon didn't have a weapon on him. Now, the first thing that goes in my head is, where's this weapon at?
The forensic team arrive on scene at 8:35 p.m. and start collecting evidence.
In the laundry room, they find a box of ammunition, a .380 pistol magazine, 2 deformed bullets, which I believe were found behind the dryer and by the dryer duct, and then 3 shell casings, which indicate that 3 shots had been fired. In the home, there was also 3 cell phones recovered. The evidence that the police have at that time all point to Brandon having a firearm, a .380 pistol. I had gotten off of work and I got a phone call from one of my family members, and they told me that you were right. He killed her. I was completely devastated.
Got a phone call from Angel's other grandmother, and she said to me, Elena's been shot. And I knew she was gone. I knew it. Yeah, they wouldn't let me in the house. They wouldn't let me see her. The kids were in the police car, and Angel was screaming, and the little ones were crying, and the police took us all to the station house.
Angel tells Detective Hosang that earlier in that evening that there was a fight between her mother and Brandon, and that because of that argument, Elena packed up her and her children and left to go to her mother's house. They ultimately ended up turning around and going back home because Angel wanted to get her pregnant cat. That is when Elena discovers that Brandon had destroyed the house. Elena is then headbutted in the face in front of the children by Brandon. At that point, she walks into the laundry room. Brandon Wysong follows her into the laundry room, slams the door. The children hear 3 gunshots and see Brandon run out of the back of the house. Angel was able to break through the laundry room and crawl through the hole in the door. She then grabs some towels and tries to use them to put pressure on her mom's head to stop the bleeding. It was at that point she used her mother's phone to call 911. Bobby was 5 years old at the time, and the interviewer asked him to draw pictures of what he saw, and what he drew was very disturbing. Bobby drew several photos. One of them was his mother lying in a pool of blood, Brandon with a firearm. There was also another photo that he described as his mother, which was a photo of someone with a gunshot wound to the head.
At 10:28 p.m., Detective Andre Jerry and Detective Jakimiak interview Brandon Wysong.
Me and my partner obviously here to talk to you a little about what happened tonight. Kind of get your side of it.
I had no doubt in my mind that he'd done it, just from the totality of all the circumstances.
I failed her as a husband.
So during the interview, Brandon was just hot and cold.
Bro, I viewed her as my queen, bro. It's my job to protect her.
But then, a lot of the times in the interview, he would put the blame on her. He would say things like, she made me do it, and I told her this was coming, it's her fault.
The extent that she went to sabotage my character, to lie about me, mind-blowing.
At one point in time, he said, I did it, there's no question.
I headbutt her, and she walks out the door by the laundry room, where I closed the door.
Door to what?
The laundry room. And I pulled the slide back, and I shot her 3 times.
Going into this interview, there was 2 major goals. One was to find out why he did what he did, and the second one was to find out where the murder weapon was.
Where's it at? I'm asking you for a couple reasons. That's a house full of kids, and there's kids.
There's no gun in the house. Not in the house. You're gonna have to talk with the Commonwealth's attorney. And y'all are gonna have to work out some deal with me if you want me to tell you where the gun is. I mean, I've already made the admission.
I agree.
You already got the conviction.
You could tell he was just thinking about himself. He was trying to cut a deal. I told him that if you show us where the weapon is, they're willing to work with you.
You can tell me where the gun's at?
Yes.
Okay.
You would have to take me there.
Brandon believes that he is making this deal, and in exchange, he says he will lead them to the murder weapon.
So on the way to find the murder weapon, he just acted like he didn't have a care in the world. There was no remorse. You could tell he was just thinking about himself. I mean, to be able to shoot and kill your wife and then not have a care in the world, especially when you got kids with that person, it just, I mean, he had no soul, no conscience. So Brandon leads us to the wooded area, maybe 20 feet from where he surrendered. We find a black Ruger 380, which matched the shell casings that we found on scene and the box of ammo that was in the house. Once the gun is found, we turn over forensics, they'll dust it for prints, and then it gets run through our NIBIN, where they'll do a test fire, and they'll match the casing, and that's where they're able to tell it's a direct match.
Brandon is charged with the second-degree murder of Elena Wysong and transported to Virginia Beach City Jail.
The next day, an autopsy of Elena was performed at the office of the chief medical examiner in Norfolk, and the medical examiner determined that the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. When we receive our case file, we received a cell phone dump of Brandon's phone. And what I found on the phone was disturbing. There were text messages that showed the abuse that was occurring. He had photos saved of Elena's black eyes and bruises. There was some very, very disturbing things in that phone. When determining whether we should take something to trial, there are so many different considerations that go into play. And one of the main ones in this case was saving Angel from having to testify. Because I truly believe I would have been re-victimizing Angel to put her on a stand in front of 14 strangers she doesn't know to explain in excruciating detail the worst day of her life. We also talked to the victim's family extensively. I don't want to offer a plea deal that the family of our victim is not on board with, because ultimately we want justice for Elena and Elena's family. We want them to feel like they got justice for her as much as we can. We can't bring Elena back. When talking about a plea deal, I really want them to have the final say, because it gives them some sort of agency, some sort of control. You're taking that control away from Brandon, someone who always wants to be in control. They didn't choose to lose Elena. They didn't choose to be a part of this, but they can choose whether they want to offer a plea agreement, and they can choose how they want to see this resolved. After speaking with Elena's family, we ultimately came to the decision to offer the defendant a plea agreement. Under the plea agreement, the maximum active time Brandon could get to serve was 30 years. After Brandon accepts the plea for 30 years, I start pulling up jail calls. And I do that because a lot of times people are more willing to talk after they know that they have a plea agreement and their case is not going to trial.
Was she screaming when you shot her in the arm and in the back?
No.
Like, what?
No. Nope.
What was she doing?
She was in the corner cowering, like huddled up in the corner with her hands behind her head.
All right, now what happened? How did you do it, man? How did you shoot her?
Execution style in the back of the head, man.
I can't say that I've ever heard anything like that. And he made that decision at that moment to shoot her execution style with her kids in the next room was shocking.
4 years after Elena's murder, her family attend Brandon's sentencing hearing.
I remember me and Angel were holding on to each other. I don't think I've ever held her hand that tightly before. And I remember both of us were shaking. We were waiting for him to step out from behind that door and look at us both in the face.
At the sentencing hearing, we put on a lot of evidence because we wanted to convince the judge that he should sentence Brandon to the maximum amount of time allowable under the plea agreement and sentence him to 30 years. I also offered into evidence the jail calls where he describes in excruciating detail how he execution style shot Elena in the back of her head as she's towering in the corner. I read Angel's victim impact statement, and it was hard because there was so much emotion in there.
I miss my mom every day. I can't sleep without dreaming of her and seeing you kill her again. I can't go to school because everyone has a mom but me. You waited for us and broke everything at home to torture my mom and us. You beat her in front of me and then shot her in the head. I was 12 years old, Bobby was 5, and Alora 4 when you took our whole family away. I have anxiety and depression because of you. She was loving and kind to everyone. How could you cause her murder and explode our lives? I held her head to stop the bleeding. Her eyes were purple where you beat her, and I couldn't stop you. Now we have a hole in our hearts that will never heal, and fear if you get out to kill us too. I hope you die in jail and they never let you out to hurt another person. I hope you suffer like you made my mom suffer.
The judge sentences Brandon Wysong to serve the full 30 years under the plea agreement for the second-degree murder of Elena Wysong.
I would have loved it if he had gotten a life sentence, because that's what I think he deserves. I miss her laugh. I miss her phone calls. I miss her coming over and we just laugh and talk. I miss going out with her to do things with the kids.
She wasn't there for a lot of the big things in my life. When I first got my license, when I got my name legally changed, when I graduated high school, when I took my first testosterone shot.
So how are you doing today?
There's no substitution for that loss. The hole is always there.
Sometimes you just have to say, screw it all. Let's just go do something fun. Come here, Rose.
In California, fear did not arrive all at once. It arrived in layers, like fog moving in from the dark edge of a neighborhood while people were still inside their kitchens, rinsing plates and turning off lamps. It arrived in the pause after a dog barked at nothing visible, in the click of a window lock tested twice instead of once. In the thin, private moment before sleep when a woman listened to the house settle and wondered whether that sound had always been there. Long before the name Golden State Killer existed, long before Joseph James D'Angelo became an old man seated in a courtroom under fluorescent light, there was only a shape in the dark moving through California suburbia with a patience so unnatural it seemed almost supernatural. He did not need to run. He did not need to shout. He did not need to leave behind a face anyone could confidently remember. He moved through fences, side yards, canals, cul-de-sacs, and bedrooms with the cold assurance of someone who understood that terror multiplies most effectively when it cannot be pinned to a single image. He was there. And then he was gone, and afterward the houses remained standing exactly where they had always stood. But the people inside them no longer belonged to the same world they had occupied the night before. The story of the Golden State Killer begins in that shift, in the quiet rearrangement of reality that happens when an unseen predator forces entire communities to learn a new definition of night. California in the 1970s should have looked like promise. Suburbs were expanding. Families were moving into neighborhoods with a fresh paint, trimmed lawns, thin young trees, and the practical optimism of middle-class routine. Streets curved gently around developments built to feel safe. There were bicycles in driveways, station wagons in carports, televisions glowing blue behind curtains, and the hum of sprinklers in the evening when the air cooled just enough to make domestic life feel earned. People believed in locks, of course, but they also believed in distance, in neighborhood watchfulness, in the comforting idea that danger belonged elsewhere, in rougher places, among rougher people, in headlines that happened to somebody else. What D'Angelo would do over years and across regions was not merely attack individuals. He would vandalize that belief. He would teach whole towns that safety is not a structure built from good schools, trimmed hedges, and mortgage payments. It is only a feeling. And feelings can be broken. The first break did not sound like history. It sounded like a screen rustling in the dark. A gate eased open. A whisper of movement in a backyard, a young couple asleep under summer air. A woman waking because some ancient animal part of the mind had already understood what the conscious mind was still trying to deny. Then the flashlight. Then the commands. Then the realization, sudden and absolute, that the house was no longer a home, but a stage controlled by someone else. This is what made the crime so haunting even before the nation knew they were linked. They invaded the most intimate geometry of ordinary life. Bedrooms, hallways, bedside tables, family photographs on dressers. The glass of water left out for the night, the blanket folded back by a familiar hand before sleep. He entered those spaces not with the theatrical rage of a man making a point, but with the practical ritual of a predator who had repeated the movement in his mind until every step felt inevitable. By the time the victims understood what was happening, he had already crossed the only boundary that truly matters in crimes like these. The one between private safety and chosen helplessness, and all across California, people would begin to realize that the same faceless intruder might be studying their houses too. There is a special dread reserved for crimes that do not stay local. A burglary in one town may feel like misfortune. A rape in another may feel like a tragedy bounded by geography. But when the pattern stretches, when police departments begin to hear echoes of the same voice, the same bindings, the same prowling, the same strange cruelty, fear becomes migratory. It travels faster than evidence. It slips from county to county through newspaper columns, through television reports, through the trembling retelling of women who survived and men who could not protect them, through the stunned recognition that someone out there is not improvising evil, but practicing it. By the time the public imagination started to form a silhouette around him, he had already passed through several identities in the eyes of law enforcement and the press. A prowler, a burglar, a rapist, a killer. Different jurisdictions named different fragments of the same nightmare, because fragments were all anyone had. That fragmentation became part of his power. He was not one case. He was many. He was a crime spree broken into bureaucratic pieces. Each piece understood too late. Each piece waiting for someone to step back far enough to see the whole shape in the dark. And even then, seeing the shape was not the same as catching the man. Decades would pass before the name Joseph James DeAngelo would harden around the old mystery like concrete around buried steel. In the meantime, the predator would age, neighborhoods would change. Trees would grow taller than the roofs they once barely cleared. Children who had slept under the long fear of those years would become adults with children of their own. Some victims would try to build ordinary lives over memories that never again allowed ordinary sleep. Some would speak. Some would not. Some would wake at every sound for the rest of their lives. And somewhere, hidden in plain sight, the man who did it would mow lawns, pay bills, speak to neighbors, and let time perform the dirtiest magic in criminal history. The transformation of living terror into unresolved legend. That is the second hook of this story. It is not only about what happened in the bedrooms and houses of California, it is about the endurance of the unknown. For years, he was not just a criminal. He was an unfinished sentence hanging over the lives of everyone he touched. Survivors grew older without an arrest. Investigators retired. Files thickened. Evidence waited in refrigerated drawers and paper envelopes. While technology struggled to catch up with human evil, the case acquired names, documentaries, theories, and obsessive communities of people trying to force order onto chaos. But none of that changed the central insult. He was still out there, or had been, or might still be. The uncertainty became generational. Parents told their children to lock windows because of a man the children had never seen. Women who moved into houses with sliding glass doors felt a pulse of inherited fear, even if they had not lived through the original years. The crimes outlasted their own moment and entered folklore, but it was a folklore built from police reports and shattered lives rather than myth. The state itself seemed too large to hold him. California, with its distance and variety and endless contradictions, its inland heat and coastal dusk, its neat suburbs and open drainage canals, its bedroom communities and commuter roads, became the landscape of a long pursuit in which the land always seemed to offer just one more place to disappear. The image that opens this story is not only a man in a mask, though there were masks, flashlights, shoelaces, cords, and the other practical objects through which he imposed control. The opening image is a neighborhood after one of his visits. Dawn coming pale over lawns still wet with sprinklers. Police cars parked at odd angles. Neighbors standing in robes, arms folded against the morning chill, speaking too quietly because normal volume no longer fits the scene. A husband staring at his own front door as though it has betrayed him. A woman wrapped in a blanket she cannot feel. Detectives moving room to room, noting points of entry, collecting impressions, measuring distances, hearing from the survivors details so unbearable and so specific that they seem both too human and too impossible to belong in the same sentence. Outside, school buses will still run. Someone down the block will still leave for work. The mail will still come. But the neighborhood has changed species. It belongs now to the map of a hunter. That map would keep expanding. What makes the Golden State Killer story so uniquely chilling is not just the body count, or the years, or the forensic breakthrough that finally ended the mystery. It is the way the crime seemed to evolve with the predator's appetite and confidence. Early prowling became burglary. Burglary became sexual violence. Sexual violence became murder. The escalation makes the whole case feel like watching a storm system gather intelligence as it moves. He learned. He adapted. He listened to police. He understood fear as a tool and delay as an ally. He entered homes before attacks, studied routines, stole objects that seemed meaningless until they became symbols of surveillance. Victims were not chosen at random in the shallow sense of the word. They were selected, watched, approached through windows and yards and habits. By the time he came through a door or a bedroom threshold, he often knew the territory better than the people who believed they lived safely inside it. This was not only violence, it was occupation. For the victims, the worst part may not even have been the first second of his arrival, but the realization that he had likely already been there in smaller, invisible ways. Watching, learning, waiting. That realization is poison to the mind. It reaches backward and corrupts memory itself. Every earlier creak becomes suspicious. Every missing object becomes evidence. Every uneasy feeling dismissed a week before becomes unbearable in retrospect. And because he operated across such a wide span of time and place, that poison spread into the culture around the case. California did not merely fear a man, it feared the possibility that ordinary life was porous. That a person could be observed through the soft fabric of habit without ever knowing where the seam had opened. Still, for all the darkness of the crimes, the hook of this case cannot belong to the predator alone. It belongs equally to the survivors, because their existence denied him total authorship of the story. He entered homes intending to dominate narrative itself, to decide how people would remember night, marriage, intimacy, and fear. Yet people lived. They remembered. They spoke. Their voices, shaken or steady, immediate or delayed by years, kept the case alive long after official momentum faltered. A woman describing the sound of dishes placed on a man's back to force stillness. A husband remembering the helpless arithmetic of following orders because disobedience might mean death for both of them. A survivor recalling the smell of the intruder, the muttered threats, the impossible pressure of trying to stay alive inside a scene already stripped of reason. These fragments mattered because they kept the offender from dissolving into abstraction. They said he was real. He had a voice. He had habits. He had a method. He had not come from nowhere, and he had not vanished into myth. Someone had done this. Someone with blood, skin, family, history, and eventually, one day, a name. But in part 1, before the genealogical databases and the courtroom pleas and the old man in the wheelchair, we stay with the long shadow instead. We stay with California under siege by something it could not yet fully name. We stay with warm nights broken open by a flashlight beam, with backyards holding footprints in wet soil, with women sitting upright in bed after midnight because sleep no longer felt like surrender to rest but surrender to chance. We stay with investigators moving from county to county, carrying reports that looked too similar to ignore and too scattered to solve. We stay with the feeling that this was not one man's crime wave alone, but a kind of infection in the idea of home. Because that is what Joseph James DeAngelo became long before he became identifiable. He became the whisper beneath domestic life. The proof that a house can be sealed, suburban, respectable, and still not keep out what has already chosen it. The proof that a predator does not need speed when he has patience. The proof that time can be weaponized just as effectively as force. And above all, the proof that unresolved violence does not end when the offender leaves the room. It lingers in architecture, in marriage, in aging, in sleeplessness, in children who grow up absorbing a fear their parents never wanted to hand down. This is how the story opens. Not with an arrest, not with a body, not with a name, but with a state slowly learning that night has changed. That the ordinary rules of safety have been rewritten by someone moving silently through windows and yards, and that the man responsible will remain for far too long, not a captured criminal, but a breathing absence at the edge of every locked door. And perhaps the cruelest part of the opening is that no one in those first years could know they were standing at the beginning of one of the longest, most psychologically corrosive manhunts in American history. They only knew the local version of terror, the police sketch tacked to a board. The patrol car rolling slowly through streets that had once needed no such reassurance. The husband buying new locks at a hardware store under fluorescent light, pretending this was practical, not desperate. The mother checking windows in her daughter's room before bed. The detective driving home at dawn with another statement in his briefcase, and the sick certainty that somewhere, in another neighborhood not yet warned loudly enough, someone was already being watched. That is how true dread works. It does not explode. It accumulates. It teaches people to perform normal life while carrying a private rehearsal of what they will do if glass breaks at 2 in the morning. It teaches them the weight of a flashlight beam under a bedroom door. It teaches them that evil can be disciplined, patient, even domestic in its outward rhythms. And in the years before his name was known, that lesson spread quietly from one California community to another, leaving behind not only crime scenes but a new emotional climate, one in which darkness no longer meant rest. Only the possibility that somewhere beyond the hedges and fences, a man with no face yet was deciding whose life he would enter next. He had not been caught or named, and that unfinished fact made every report feel provisional. Every survivor's memory, both testimony and warning, every untouched house on every block seemed less like shelter than a door waiting. California in the 1970s was a place that seemed built from contradiction, under the hard white glare of daytime. Subdivisions looked clean, expansive, and full of promise, stitched together by fresh roads, tract houses, chain-link fences, and the small domestic ambitions of people who believed they were buying not only property, but a more orderly future. Yet after dark, those same neighborhoods could feel strangely exposed. A row of identical roofs offered no comfort when the street fell quiet. Backyard gates clicked softly in the wind. Irrigation ditches carried black water beneath the moon. Citrus groves, schoolyards, levees, bike paths, and half-built developments created seams between civilization and shadow. Little pockets of darkness where a man could stand unseen and study the habits of other people's lives. That setting mattered. The Golden State Killer did not emerge from a landscape of visible ruin. He emerged from places that believed themselves modern, practical, aspirational, and safe. He moved through middle-class California at the exact moment when many families were settling into the optimism of post-war suburban expansion, trusting that a well-lit kitchen, a deadbolt, a nearby patrol car, and a quiet block of respectable homes formed a meaningful barrier against evil. The case would reveal how fragile that trust really was. Sacramento in those years was growing fast, its suburbs spreading outward over land that still remembered being rural. New developments rose beside open fields, drainage canals, and stretches of undeveloped ground that seemed harmless by day and tactically useful by night. Young families were buying homes with sliding glass doors and modest yards. Men commuted, mowed lawns, fixed sprinklers, and spoke about interest rates and overtime. Women built routines around grocery stores, children's bedrooms, school pickup lines, laundry rooms, and the practical architecture of family life. There were neighborhood barbecues, television sets glowing in dense, dogs behind fences, and children riding bicycles until the evening light thinned into amber and their names were called from front porches. The visual language of that world was ordinary in the most reassuring way. It suggested repetition. And repetition suggests safety. A man who lives on a block long enough begins to believe he understands the boundaries of his danger. He knows which car belongs where, which dog barks too much, Which screen door slams? Which neighbor leaves for work before dawn? He comes to trust pattern. D'Angelo's crimes were so devastating in part because they turned pattern into camouflage. He watched routines and used them as entry points. He approached homes not as a chaotic drifter, but as a patient student of other people's habits. The neighborhoods gave him what he needed: predictability, access points, and darkness without total isolation. Southern California, when the series later widened, offered a different version of the same illusion. The climate was milder, the neighborhoods denser in some places, the emotional atmosphere touched by the distinct optimism of coastal life. But the same foundational myth remained intact. Houses were homes. Bedrooms were private. The world outside the window belonged to the ordinary dangers people already knew how to imagine. Burglars, vandals, maybe a prowler if the news had been especially ugly lately. What people were not prepared to imagine was a single offender crossing jurisdictions, evolving in method, and carrying a private map of fear through multiple counties over years. That gap between what residents could imagine and what was actually happening is central to the background of the case. The Golden State Killer thrived inside institutional fragmentation as much as physical darkness. One sheriff's department saw one pattern, another saw another. One city dealt with prowling, another with burglary, another with sexual assault, another, later, with homicide. Bureaucracies are built to categorize. Predators who move intelligently can make those categories work for them. California's size intensified that problem. The state was too large, too decentralized, too full of separate departments and local pressures for the whole pattern to be visible at once. By the time investigators in one region began to suspect something more organized and predatory, the offender had already learned from earlier crimes somewhere else. The social background mattered just as much as the geography. This was a period when public conversations about sexual violence, home invasion trauma, and victim psychology were far less mature than they would later become. Many survivors were not met with the depth of understanding or the coordinated care such crimes demanded. Men who survived attacks alongside their partners often had to absorb a particularly corrosive form of shame, the impossible feeling that survival itself had become evidence of failure. Women were left to navigate not only terror and bodily violation, but the cultural burden of being scrutinized, doubted, or quietly expected to resume normal life before the mind had even begun to metabolize what had happened. In that world, silence became common. And silence helped him. Every family that tried to move on quietly rather than relive the nightmare in public added to the delay between crime and collective comprehension. Yet the communities were not weak, they were simply unprepared. They installed floodlights, bought stronger locks, formed neighborhood watches, slept with loaded guns nearby, and learned to read the night differently. Fear became practical. Parents taught children not just to come home before dark, but to notice strange cars, strange footsteps, strange men standing where no one should be standing. Couples developed rituals before bed, checking windows, checking doors, checking the side yard, checking again. This constant vigilance forms part of the setting because it tells us how deeply the offender altered daily life. He did not merely attack individuals. He entered the nervous system of suburban California and taught entire communities to flinch. The offender himself belonged to that world more intimately than anyone initially understood. Joseph James D'Angelo was not an alien force descending on California from some lawless outside. He was native to its systems, to its roads, to its rhythms, and most chillingly, to its institutions of order. He served as a police officer in Exeter and later in Auburn during years that overlap with major portions of the crime series. That fact changes the background of the case in a profound way. It suggests not only a man comfortable with procedure, patrol patterns, flashlight work, evidence handling, and the psychology of fear, but a man whose daily life placed him within the symbolic machinery of protection while his private life was built around violation. The uniform matters even when it is not worn during the crimes. It shapes posture, confidence, tactical thinking, and the ability to move through darkness with deliberate authority. It teaches a person how residents react to commands, how victims freeze, how police departments communicate, and how long it may take before a fragmented investigation becomes a truly coordinated threat. D'Angelo's background appears to have combined resentment, volatility, and compulsive control in ways that suited this double existence. He was not publicly legible as a mythic monster. He had jobs, relationships, routines, and the outward structure of an ordinary man. But ordinary men do not prowl houses with such ritualized patience. Ordinary men do not study neighborhoods, move through windows and side gates, hoard stolen objects, and repeatedly turn the private spaces of sleeping families into theaters of domination. The dissonance between public surface and private action is not a decorative detail in this case. It is the engine of it. He appears to have drawn strength from secrecy itself, from the knowledge that he could move between his official or domestic identities and his hidden predatory self without anyone around him naming the bridge between them. In a state as large and culturally varied as California, such compartmentalization could persist longer than anyone wanted to believe. The era also contributed to the offender's invisibility in another way: mobility. California was built around movement. Highways stitched distant counties together. People commuted, relocated, vacationed, and started over. A man could leave one area, enter another, and still appear unremarkable. Cars made distance manageable, and distance made pattern recognition harder. When crimes occurred in Sacramento, then elsewhere, then later in Southern California, investigators were forced to ask whether similarity meant a single evolving offender or simply resemblance within a state full of criminals. Today, with national databases, shared platforms, and decades of behavioral analysis behind us, the eventual linkage can feel inevitable. At the time, it was not. It had to be argued for. It had to be defended against skepticism, jurisdictional pride, thin budgets, incomplete communication, and the ordinary human tendency to protect local narratives. No department likes to hear that its nightmare may be part of someone else's larger design. Yet the background of the Golden State Killer case is precisely that design unfolding across institutional boundaries while the state itself grew around it. There is another layer to this setting that cannot be ignored: gendered domestic life. Many of the targeted homes represented a specific suburban arrangement: young couples, children, carefully maintained routines. The bedroom as emotional center of married or family life. D'Angelo attacked not only bodies but relational structures. He entered homes where intimacy had been built slowly through trust and routine, then used that trust against the victims. He forced men into helpless witness roles. He weaponized women's terror. He transformed marriage beds into crime scenes. This is why the aftermath of his attacks reached so deeply into homes and communities. He did not strike anonymous public space. He reached into the chamber people reserve for tenderness, sleep, sex, and vulnerability. In doing so, he contaminated not just memory, but architecture. A hallway is no longer a hallway after someone has crawled down it with a gun and a flashlight. A window is no longer just a window after you understand it may have once framed the eyes of a man watching you undress. The broader cultural backdrop of California, with its mix of sunshine mythology and private unease, only made this contamination more disorienting. This was a state sold to itself and the nation as freedom, mobility, leisure, reinvention, and possibility. The crimes exposed another California running underneath that image. A California of unlocked assumptions, fragmented institutions, dark subdivisions, and hidden male rage. They showed how quickly sunshine can give way to panic once the sun drops and the blinds are drawn. That contrast gives the Golden State Killer story much of its cinematic force. Palms and patios by day, flashlight beams and whispered threats by night. Cul-de-sacs decorated for family life, while somewhere nearby a man is crouched behind a fence, listening, timing, planning. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the background had shifted from optimism to siege in some affected communities. Media coverage intensified, composite sketches circulated. Terms like East Area Rapist and Original Night Stalker entered public language, fragmentary names for a figure not yet fully understood. People began to inhabit their neighborhoods differently. The evening was no longer neutral. A side gate left open was no longer a forgettable mistake, a missing bicycle, a moved object, a strange footprint in the flower bed. These details could trigger real fear. In a sense, the setting of the case became psychological as much as physical. California's suburbs remained beautiful, or at least livable. But their emotional weather had changed. Safety was no longer assumed. It had to be negotiated nightly. This is the world in which Part 2 rests. A vast, growing state that believed in domestic progress. A network of suburban neighborhoods bordered by practical darkness. A law enforcement landscape divided by jurisdiction. A social culture not yet fully equipped to understand the long afterlife of sexual violence. And within all of that, a man who knew how to move through space, through secrecy, and through institutional blind spots with terrifying fluency. The background to the Golden State Killer is not just that he lived in California. It is that California, in all its expansiveness and contradiction, gave him the precise mixture of opportunity, cover, and delay he needed. He had roads. He had darkness. He had neighborhoods that trusted their own design. He had police systems that did not immediately share one mind. He had a culture that still underestimated the intelligence and endurance of this type of predator. And he had time to learn. Time to escalate, time to vanish into ordinary middle age while entire communities kept one eye on the night and one eye on the files that never closed. When the arrest finally came, decades later, it would feel almost unreal precisely because the background had lasted so long. But in the years when the crimes were unfolding, none of that future certainty existed. There was only California under a widening shadow, a state still trying to sell itself a dream of safety while behind closed bedroom doors, that dream was being methodically dismantled one terrified household at a time. Before the Golden State Killer became a solved name and an old face under courtroom light, he existed in the lives of his victims as interruption. He entered not only houses, but rhythms. He cut through evenings that had begun in complete ordinariness, through marriages still being built, through children asleep in nearby rooms, through the quiet domestic habits that make people believe tomorrow will resemble today. That is why the victim's story in this case cannot be told as a procession of crime statistics. It has to be told as the story of many private worlds, each one complete in itself before he crossed the threshold. A woman rinsing dishes while listening for the dryer to finish. A man checking the sliding door before bed and feeling satisfied that the house was secure. A young couple falling asleep in the warm interior darkness of suburban California. Faint night air coming through a cracked window. A dog shifting in another room. The neighborhood outside so still it seemed almost staged. None of these people experienced themselves as characters in a future true crime narrative. They were busy being husbands, wives, daughters, sons, students, workers, parents, neighbors, and partners. The violence gained much of its power from that fact. It did not strike people already standing at the edge of obvious danger. It moved in on the middle of life while life was still unfolding. Many of the victims were young women, often living with or married to men who believed their role in the home included a basic capacity to protect. Some were mothers, some were newly coupled, still arranging furniture, habits, and shared routines into the shape of a life together. Some had children in the next room. And that detail matters because it magnifies the emotional architecture of the attacks. The fear in those bedrooms was never limited to one body. A woman under threat was often listening not only for the predator's breathing, but for the possibility that her husband might move and be killed. That her child might wake, that the violence might spill into the hallway and make the whole house a place from which no one emerged intact. In that sense, the victim's story is about family systems under siege. He did not merely harm individuals, he rearranged the emotional foundations of homes. A man who survives an attack while forced into helpless stillness beside or near the woman he loves does not return unchanged to the old shape of himself. A woman who survives repeated threats in her own bedroom does not step back into sleep as though sleep were still innocent. Children too young to understand details may still absorb the temperature of terror in the house afterward. The whispers, the sudden locks, the strange absence in their parents' eyes. The case left long shadows because it entered domestic life at its point of greatest vulnerability. One of the most difficult truths about the Golden State Killer's victims is that many survived. And survival in this case was not simple rescue. It was a long, unchosen life sentence of memory, sensory recall, mistrust, and endurance. Popular crime storytelling often narrows victims into two categories, the dead and the lucky. This case resists that cruelty. The women who lived were not lucky in any easy sense. They carried forward with a knowledge of terror that reshaped how their bodies inhabited the world. Ordinary sounds could become threats. A footstep outside the house, a rustle in shrubs, the beam of a flashlight during a power outage, a husband getting out of bed too suddenly, a window left open because the evening was warm. Trauma does not remain in the past merely because the calendar moves. It colonizes the present. It teaches the nervous system that what happened once can happen again at any moment, especially in spaces once associated with safety. For many survivors, home itself had been poisoned. The bedroom, the hallway, the side yard. Even the sound of cutlery or dishes set down in another room could be made to vibrate with memory. Yet if survival complicates the victim story, it also enlarges it. These women and men were not erased. They testified through their continued existence. They went on raising children, divorcing, reconciling, relocating, working, aging, and trying in public and private to create lives larger than what had been done to them. Some spoke early, some could not. Some guarded details for decades because speech itself felt like surrendering what little privacy remained. Others became fierce. Public witnesses, refusing to let the offender remain a mythic shadow. Their courage did not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looked like answering another detective's question after years of exhaustion. Sometimes it looked like getting through another night. Sometimes it looked like admitting to a spouse that fear was still present 30 years later. That, too, is part of victimhood in this story. The murders, when they came, gave the case an even darker register. Here the victim's story narrows to people whose futures were taken entirely, and the emotional weight of that theft cannot be measured only by the facts of death. These were daughters, sons, partners, mothers, fathers, friends. They had habits and moods and unfinished arguments and upcoming errands. Some had plans for the next morning. Some had children who would grow up inside the wreckage of unanswered questions. A murder victim in a serial case is too often remembered only through the offender's pattern. Where she lived, how she died. Whether the method matched earlier crimes, but real grief begins elsewhere. It begins in the kitchen chair. No one moves for weeks. In a closet where clothes still smell faintly like the person who wore them. In relatives sorting through practical objects and discovering how violently practical tasks can feel after loss. In the intolerable realization that the person who should be at the table has been reduced in public memory to a file, a map point, or a date. The victim story has to push back against that reduction. It has to insist that every household he entered was already full of meaning before he arrived. This was especially true because many of the targeted couples and families were not living glamorous or exceptional lives. They were living recognizable ones. They worried about mortgage payments, children's routines, repairs, work hours, and all the mundane negotiations that make up adulthood. A wife might have gone to bed irritated about something small. A husband might have forgotten to take out the trash. A mother might have laid out school clothes for the next day. These tiny details matter because they restore proportion. Evil does not only interrupt grand destinies, It interrupts laundry, dinner, bickering, fatigue, and the 1,000 unremarkable gestures through which people love one another without naming it. In this case, the ordinariness of the victims' lives deepened the horror because the offender seemed to understand exactly what ordinary life trusted. He selected not just bodies, but settings where privacy, routine, and affection would heighten helplessness. Another painful dimension of the victim story lies in the way couples experienced the crimes together, yet differently. The men who survived were often immobilized, listening, bargaining internally, trying to stay alive without provoking more violence. That experience can shatter identity. Many likely carried a private, corrosive shame, not because they had failed in any moral sense, but because culture had taught them that manhood included protection. The offender attacked that expectation deliberately. He made men witnesses to their own powerlessness, for wives and partners. The presence of a loved man in the room was both comfort and torment. He was there, but could not save them. He was alive, but vulnerable. He heard, but could not intervene without risking death for both. Afterward, marriages had to continue under the pressure of that knowledge. Some couples held together through shared survival. Others fractured under the strain. Love can endure trauma, but trauma changes the terms under which love must operate. Intimacy, sleep, physical closeness, even silence in the dark can become loaded with meanings no one chose. The Golden State Killer did not only leave injured individuals behind. He left altered marriages, altered parenthood, altered family systems, and altered concepts of trust. There were also victims who were children indirectly, children whose parents were attacked or murdered. Children who woke into the aftermath without fully understanding why the house had changed. They may have seen police lights on curtains, heard adult voices forced into hushed tones, watched surviving relatives answer questions they could not yet bear to hear. Childhood can absorb fear long before it can explain it. A house that suddenly becomes a place of whispers, locks, and tears teaches a child that the world has shifted. Even if the details are hidden, those children grew up carrying secondhand trauma that was not secondhand in its effects. Their stories belong here too. So do the stories of parents of survivors, siblings of murdered victims, and extended families who spent years learning that trauma echoes through kinship, like sound, through connected rooms. Another truth must be faced carefully, because the offender was not identified for decades. Many victims lived with a peculiar kind of unfinished grief. There was no arrest to contain the past, no courtroom to gather around, no final face onto which memory could be fixed. Instead, there was the open wound of uncertainty. He was out there somewhere, aging, perhaps watching the news, perhaps shopping for groceries, perhaps joking with neighbors, perhaps passing unnoticed through the same world his victims had to struggle to re-enter. That fact deepened injury. Trauma often searches for boundaries. It wants to know where the danger lives now. In this case, the danger had a body still moving freely through the state. Survivors had to build lives knowing the man who changed them had not yet been made answerable. Some likely feared seeing him in crowds without knowing. Some may have wondered whether he ever returned to neighborhoods, whether he read about them, whether he held souvenirs not only of their homes, but of their fear. This long delay made the victim story unlike the story in many closed cases. Their suffering existed not only in memory, but in real time alongside the offender's continued freedom. To tell part 3 honestly, one must also resist the urge to flatten the victims into helplessness. They were frightened, yes. Wounded, yes. Some were killed, but they were also resilient in ways that do not fit cleanly into inspirational language. Resilience can be messy. It can coexist with panic, rage, divorce, addiction, sleeplessness, depression, and the refusal ever again to sleep with the window open. Some survivors became eloquent public voices. Others protected themselves by stepping back from attention. Both responses are dignified. Healing is not a performance, And survival is not owed to anyone in a neat form. What unites the victims is not that they became symbols of bravery. It is that they were forced into an experience no one should endure and then had to live with the consequences in bodies that remembered too much. The murdered victims, 2, deserve to be imagined not as scenes but as people in motion before the attack. A woman laughing earlier that week, a couple making ordinary plans. Someone grocery shopping, someone folding clean towels. Someone planning a visit, a meal. A phone call. The mind often recoils from the brutality of what followed by skipping backward too quickly into the mystery of the offender. But the moral center of the story lies with the people whose lives were living, not with the man who interrupted them. They gave the case its urgency, their voices, wounds, absences, and surviving families gave it shape. Without them, he is merely a name attached to pathology. They are the reason the case still matters. In the end, the victim's story in the Golden State Killer case is a story of interrupted domestic life on a vast scale. It is the story of women whose bedrooms became crime scenes and who still found ways to continue living. It is the story of men forced into witness positions designed to break their sense of self. It is the story of children whose homes changed temperature overnight. It is the story of murdered people whose futures were not grand myths, but humble, real continuations of ordinary love and labor. And it is the story of decades spent carrying trauma without the closure of a name, until the old predator was finally identified and brought into the light. Even then, identification did not undo what had been done. It did not restore sleep as it was before, or return dead spouses, or erase the years of wondering. But it did something essential. It returned narrative weight to the people he had tried to reduce to silence. It said they had not imagined the pattern, not exaggerated the fear, not survived some shapeless legend. A human being had done this. And because he was human, the suffering of the victims was no longer drifting in myth. It was anchored in responsibility. That does not heal everything. Nothing can, but it matters. And so part 3 must leave us not with the image of an unnamed prowler in the dark, but with the people inside the houses before he arrived. Couples asleep under summer sheets, mothers checking children one last time, husbands locking doors, women making homes out of ordinary rooms, families trusting that night would be only night. The tragedy is that he entered. The dignity is that their lives, even altered or ended by his cruelty, remain the real heart of the story. The incident in the story of the Golden State Killer was never just the instant a flashlight struck a bedroom wall. It began hours earlier, sometimes days earlier, in the invisible preparation that made each attack feel less like a break-in and more like an occupation. He prowled neighborhoods first. He moved through side streets and along fences, through the thin, dark seams between homes where sprinklers had gone silent and curtains had been drawn. He studied the habits of other people with the patience of someone who believed time belonged to him. He learned where gates stuck, where dogs barked, where windows were left cracked for the night air, where a couple tended to sleep, where children's rooms were placed in relation to the master bedroom, where a telephone sat, where a porch light was habitually turned off. This was the first violence. Though no one inside the house could yet feel it, the offender had already entered the private grammar of their lives. He had already begun converting routine into vulnerability. By the time he finally crossed the threshold, the attack was not spontaneous in any meaningful sense. It was the result of selection, surveillance, rehearsal, and the slow tightening of his own appetite around a chosen address. Many victims later described details that made this clear in retrospect. Missing objects before the assault, strange sounds on earlier nights, the unsettling feeling of being watched, noticed too late, evidence that windows had been tampered with or gates opened. He had often been there before the incident. Not fully inside, perhaps, but near enough to listen, to test, to learn. That is one reason these crimes remain so psychologically devastating. The assault did not begin when the victims woke. It began when their house ceased, without their knowledge, to belong entirely to them. The night itself did some of his work. California nights in the affected neighborhoods could be thick with heat or strangely cool after sundown, but they often carried the same suburban stillness that makes small noises sound personal. A rustle in shrubs, a soft metallic click from a side gate, the faint tick of a cooling car parked along the curb. Most nights, such sounds pass through the half-sleeping mind and dissolve. On his nights, they became part of a sequence. He approached quietly, often through the backyard or another concealed path. Using darkness not for speed, but for patience. He did not rush because he did not need to rush. He had already chosen homes where ordinary confidence would slow response, where the residents were asleep, and where the neighborhood would not immediately rise at the sound of one strange movement. Sometimes he entered through a window, sometimes through a sliding glass door or another vulnerable point he had already tested. The border between outside and inside, between street and bedroom, between a stranger's will and a family's peace, was thinner than anyone had wanted to believe. And once he crossed it, everything in the house changed, meaning at once. A hallway stopped being a hallway and became a route of control. A lamp became an obstacle. A nightstand became something he might search. A bed became a place of captivity rather than rest. The victims often woke into confusion before fear could fully gather shape. There is a terrible second in such crimes where the body is awake but the mind is still trying to fit what it sees into the language of a nightmare, a misunderstanding, a household accident. Then the commands came. Sharp, controlled, often whispered or hissed rather than shouted, a flashlight in the eyes, a weapon visible enough to erase doubt. Sometimes the offender had no need to strike immediately because certainty itself was sufficient. He knew the power of abrupt authority. He understood how quickly sleep can collapse into obedience when a stranger is standing in the room already in control. He would order the man down, order the woman to comply, order stillness, order silence, order the whole house to begin obeying his private rules. He did not merely invade the home. He replaced its law with his own, for the couples he attacked. This replacement was one of the cruelest parts of the incident. He separated their roles from their instincts. The husband or boyfriend, often immediately restrained, had to lie still while hearing the terror unfold nearby. The woman, fully aware that any resistance might cost both of them their lives, had to endure the impossible arithmetic of survival under the eye of a man who seemed to draw energy from helplessness itself. He sometimes stacked plates or dishes on the man's back and threatened to kill them both if he heard movement. It was a method at once practical and sadistic. Practical because it created a crude alarm system, sadistic because it turned the body of one victim into a surface for the terror of another. The sound of ceramic shifting in the dark became a warning of death. Domestic objects, dishes from the kitchen, ordinary things touched earlier that evening for dinner or cleanup, were converted into instruments of control. That transformation captures the essence of his method. He used the home against the people who trusted it. Every incident contained an element of staging. He entered as a prowler but became, once inside, a director of fear. He bound hands, covered faces, issued commands, rearranged positions in the room, and spoke in threats designed to make resistance feel like murder waiting to happen. He sometimes ransacked lightly, sometimes lingered, sometimes ate food, drank beer, or moved through the house with a familiarity that deepened the victim's shock. He was not behaving like a burglar who had panicked after being discovered. He was behaving like someone who had come not only to steal or assault, but to dominate a contained world for as long as he wished. Time inside the attack did not pass normally. Survivors have described minutes as hours, sounds as enormous, silence as impossible to endure. Every breath mattered. Every floorboard shift mattered. The offender controlled pacing with the same cold instinct he used for entry. He would leave the room, return, move somewhere else in the house, and let the victims listen to the uncertainty. Was he leaving? Was he in the kitchen? Was he in a child's room? Was he standing just outside the door, listening? That uncertainty was part of the attack. It forced the victims to imagine horrors beyond what they could see. In this way, the incident extended beyond the physical acts into psychological occupation. He wanted the house to feel permanently penetrated by his will. Not only during the crime, but afterward, in memory. Many attacks followed a disturbingly consistent structure, but they were not mechanical in a lifeless sense. He adapted to houses, to couples, to circumstances. He listened. He adjusted. He sometimes muttered, threatened, insulted, or spoke in ways that revealed agitation beneath control. Yet even that agitation often seemed contained within ritual. He was not lashing out blindly. He was reenacting a private drama whose details changed but whose purpose remained stable. To enter, to terrorize, to dominate, and to leave behind a devastation that would outlast his footprints. Early in the series, burglary and prowling were more prominent elements. Later, the attacks evolved with greater violence and greater confidence, suggesting that the offender's internal threshold had shifted. He learned what worked. He learned how long police might take to connect patterns. He learned how fear itself could immobilize victims more effectively than force alone. And perhaps most chillingly, he appeared to enjoy not only the act of control, but the anticipation of it. This was not a man merely satisfying impulse in the moment. This was a man who planned for emotional ruin and cultivated it. The murders, when they occurred, represented the darkest extension of the same logic. By then, he was no longer simply violating homes and surviving witnesses. He was erasing lives. In those incidents, the same nocturnal entry, the same intimate invasion, the same manipulation of domestic space turned fatal in the most final sense. A home that had once held sleeping children, folded laundry, or the exhausted quiet of married life became, by dawn, a homicide scene. The offense was never only against one person. Even in murder cases, he attacked the entire emotional architecture of the household and the community around it. Neighbors woke to police lights. Children lost parents. Friends learned that the ordinary home they had visited for coffee or birthdays had become the last setting in someone's life. The whole neighborhood felt the breach. Investigators, moving room to room in the morning, could read the sequence in the details left behind. Bindings, points of entry, the displaced objects of a family's interrupted night. The terrible stillness after control had ended in death. What distinguishes these incidents from many others in American criminal history is the fusion of intimacy and mobility. He traveled, adapted, and vanished like a roaming offender. Yet once inside a house, he acted with the invasive certainty of someone claiming territory. The victims did not experience him as distant or fleeting. They experienced him inches away, whispering, ordering, breathing the same air, controlling the dimensions of the room. That closeness made memory unbearable. A gun in the dark is terrifying. A man kneeling at the bed, issuing commands while the house absorbs the sound, is worse, because he concealed his face and identity so effectively. Survivors were left with fragments rather than a whole person. A voice, a smell, a shape, a pattern of movement. The mind clings to such fragments because it wants to make a body out of terror. Yet during those years, a full body would not come. There was only the repeated incident, stretching across counties and time, proving the same nameless man could enter one house after another and remain unnamed. The attacks also carried the humiliation of familiarity. He knew the private language of homes. He knew where people kept glasses, where they put dishes, where telephones sat, where bedrooms opened off hallways, how to use household objects to reinforce control. This knowledge made him seem less like an intruder than like a contaminant, something using the victim's own domestic environment as a weapon. It is hard to overstate what that does to memory afterward. Every object in the house becomes divided into before and after. The plate from the kitchen, the shoelaces or cords, the hallway carpet, the bedroom door. Nothing remains innocent. Survivors do not merely remember the offender, they remember the house under his influence. And that can be harder to escape because houses, unlike strangers, are supposed to remain trustworthy. In many crimes, the offender leaves and the scene is merely a scene. Here the scene was home. And home had been made complicit under threat. By the time he was done, he had not only harmed the victims physically and psychologically, he had altered where they lived inside their own minds. Part 4, then, is not about one attack, but about the anatomy of repeated invasion. It is about a man who turned patience into a weapon, who studied homes until they yielded, who used darkness not as cover for chaos, but as cover for discipline. It is about the sequence by which ordinary suburban life was converted into terror, the watching, the approach, the silent entry, the awakening, the commands, the bindings, the unbearable stillness, the movement through rooms, the lingering, the threats, and then, eventually, the departure that never truly ended because memory remained behind like a second offender in the house. He left, but he left the victims living in the wreckage of his method. And because he crossed jurisdictions in years, because he kept repeating the same essential pattern without being caught, the incident became larger than any single crime scene. It became a regional education in helplessness. A lesson taught to California in bedrooms and backyards and police reports that a predator had learned how to enter not only houses, but the private confidence of the people inside them, and that once he had done so, nothing in those rooms would ever feel entirely ordinary again. And still, perhaps the most unnerving part of the incident pattern was how often it ended with the world outside remaining intact. No sirens during the attack, no immediate capture, no dramatic chase through the neighborhood. He slipped back out into the same streets that would look almost innocent at sunrise. The lawns remained. The newspapers landed. Children down the block might still wait for the school bus. A milk carton or a cup left on a kitchen counter would still be there, untouched except by the meaning that had now attached itself to every object in the room. This return of ordinary surfaces after such intimate terror is one of the case's central cruelties. It meant the victims were forced not only to survive him, but to watch the world continue as if the night had been containable. Detectives would come. Statements would be taken, medical exams, photographs, diagrams, and all the necessary cold machinery of investigation would begin, but those things belong to aftermath. The incident itself always contained a final insult before the aftermath arrived. He chose when it ended. He chose when to step back into darkness. He chose when the victims could begin calling for help. He chose how much uncertainty to leave behind. In some cases, he telephoned afterward, extending his control beyond the walls of the house and into the days and months that followed. That detail matters because it reveals that for him, the incident was never confined to the bedroom. It included anticipation beforehand and lingering terror afterward. He wanted memory to remain active. He wanted fear to answer the telephone. He wanted survivors to understand that escape from the physical event did not necessarily mean escape from him. That is why this chapter cannot be told only as a series of break-ins. It was a campaign of psychological warfare carried out one household at a time, with each attack refining the next. By the time law enforcement fully understood the breadth of the pattern, he had already taught dozens of people the same lesson in slightly different forms, that darkness could study you, enter your home, reorder your family, and leave you alive enough to remember every second of its discipline. For many survivors, the truest measure of the incident was not the clock, but the aftersound, the hum of the refrigerator once the house fell quiet again, the tremor in a spouse's voice, the impossible brightness of morning entering a room that had become unrecognizable. He left before dawn or in the dark, but the scene he created remained awake long after he was gone. That lingering wakefulness in homes meant for sleep, was one of his most enduring crimes against the people he chose there. By the time the first investigators began to grasp what they were really looking at, the crime scenes had already started telling a story no one wanted to hear. At first, each house seemed to belong only to its own private nightmare. A patrol car would pull up under the flat light of early morning. Officers would step out into a neighborhood that still smelled faintly of watered grass, cold air, or summer dust. Curtains would twitch next door. A dog would bark and then go silent, somewhere down the block. A child too young to understand anything yet would still be eating breakfast, but inside the targeted homes, the atmosphere was entirely different. There was no ordinary domestic silence there. There was the stunned, ruptured silence that follows when a house has been forcibly rewritten during the night. Beds were no longer just beds. Windows were no longer just windows. A hallway no longer simply connected rooms. Everything had been rearranged by fear. And the first task of law enforcement was to enter that rearranged space and listen carefully enough to what remained. The discovery phase in the Golden State Killer case did not come from a single dramatic revelation. Not at first. It emerged house by house, report by report, from details that seemed at once deeply personal and unnervingly repetitive. That repetition would become one of the most chilling clues of all, a point of entry in the rear of the home. Window screens tampered with or removed, shoelaces, cords, or bindings improvised from the victim's own surroundings or brought in and used with cold familiarity. A flashlight, threats whispered in the dark. Men immobilized, women terrorized. Homes lightly ransacked, as though burglary were the surface language of something much more intimate and much more controlled. Detectives and patrol officers working those early scenes were forced to perform two jobs at once. They had to protect and interview traumatized victims whose bodies and minds were still in the first raw stage of survival. And they had to study the environment for patterns that might survive long after individual memory broke under strain. Every object mattered. A shoe print in damp soil under a window, a fence line disturbed in the backyard, a drawer pulled half open, a missing ring, a displaced bicycle, the angle of a screen leaning against a wall, the order in which rooms appeared to have been entered, the position of dishes or household items used to enforce stillness. These were not glamorous clues, and that is precisely why they mattered. Real predators often leave behind not cinematic signatures but practical habits, tiny repeated decisions that reveal how they think about control, movement, and risk. In one neighborhood, investigators might initially have seen only an especially invasive burglary or assault. In another department might have thought it was dealing with a prowler who had escalated unpredictably. But the more scenes accumulated, the more difficult it became to ignore the peculiar sameness hiding beneath regional differences. The houses were different, the victims were different, the counties were different, yet the attacks seemed to speak one private language. The first officers on scene were often not yet standing inside history. They were doing what police always do in the aftermath of a violent home invasion. Secure the area, separate witnesses, call in detectives, preserve anything that looks like trace evidence before too many feet and too much sympathy contaminate it. Ask the first impossible questions gently enough that the victims can still answer. Which way did he come in? What did he say? What did he touch? Did he smell of anything? Did he wear gloves? Did he speak with an accent? Did he seem young? Old? Calm? Angry? Drunk? Organized? Could you hear him moving in the kitchen? The hallway, outside the bedroom. Was there one man or more than one? Many of the answers were fragments. And fragments can frustrate investigators as much as they sustain them. Trauma does not preserve memory neatly. It sharpens certain sensations and blurs others. A flashlight beam may remain vivid while the outline of a face disappears completely. The sound of breathing may be remembered more clearly than the exact words spoken. Time itself may stretch or collapse. making survivors unsure whether the offender stayed 10 minutes or 2 hours. Yet even shattered memory can produce pattern when enough people are forced to remember the same kind of nightmare. The discovery in this case, then, happened not only at the level of forensic evidence, but at the level of narrative overlap. Women in different communities describe similar methods. Men in different counties described the same humiliating stillness forced on them under threat. Investigators began to notice how the offender controlled the house, how he often entered after prior prowling, how he seemed to understand layout, movement, and fear with unsettling precision. This was not the clumsy improvisation of a panicked burglar. This was structure. Structure is one of the most dangerous clues in serial crime because it implies continuity. It means the offender has done this before or intends to do it again. Early scenes also revealed something more chilling than broken locks or stolen jewelry. They revealed intimacy with the victim's domestic space. The offender moved through homes as though he had already imagined them in the dark. He knew where to stand in a doorway and dominate the room with a flashlight. He knew how to force compliance by isolating the male partner and weaponizing the woman's fear for him. He knew how to use ordinary household objects in ways no ordinary burglar ever would. He seemed not merely present in the house, but conceptually ahead of the people who lived there. That impression stayed with many detectives and survivors. He did not feel accidental. He felt prepared. That feeling, repeated across scenes, slowly changed the case from a collection of terrible local invasions into the outline of a roaming intelligence. The physical clues were often thin in the way that smart offenders hope they will be. Footprints could be partial or contaminated by officers, neighbors, or family before a scene was fully secured. Fingerprints were not always available or usable. Entry points revealed technique, but not identity. Stolen property could vanish into pawn, trash, souvenir collections, or the private trophies of a man who understood that he was taking more than objects. Biological evidence, when preserved, would later become one of the most decisive pillars of the case, but in those years it was still only one strand among many. Powerful in theory and deeply limited by the investigative tools of the time, officers collected what they could. Swabs, fibers, impressions, statements, timelines, vehicle descriptions from anxious neighbors who had maybe seen something, maybe only imagined it after the fact. The discovery chapter of the Golden State Killer story therefore has to honor both what investigators saw immediately and what they could not yet convert into certainty. They knew something methodical was happening. They knew the offender was evolving. They knew he was not merely stealing things, but knowing that and proving who he was were worlds apart. Some of the most revealing clues were behavioral rather than material. He called some victims later. He appeared to return mentally and perhaps physically to the neighborhoods he had attacked. He seemed to savor not only the event but the continued existence of fear. That behavior told investigators something essential. They were not dealing with a man motivated solely by the practical gains of burglary or even by sexual access in a narrow sense. They were dealing with someone whose center of gravity lay in dominance, rehearsal, memory, and the extension of terror beyond the immediate scene. That insight changed how some detectives approached the case. They began to think in terms of compulsion, escalation, and offender ritual. Even if the terminology of modern profiling had not yet fully stabilized in public discourse, the discovery that the same offender might be responsible across multiple attacks was therefore not only a legal or logistical breakthrough. It was a psychological one. It allowed investigators to stop asking what happened in this house and start asking what kind of man needs to create the same theater of fear over and over again. The houses themselves became a kind of evidence archive. One subdivision in Sacramento County after another acquired an invisible overlay of meaning. A fence here where he likely waited, a canal path there that gave him an unseen route in and out, a bedroom window from which a woman had once looked out without realizing someone was looking in. Detectives returned to these neighborhoods repeatedly, walking the same routes, imagining the movement of a prowler through backyards and side yards, trying to understand how one man used ordinary suburban design against the people who trusted it. The environment was part of the clue pattern. Open access between yards, detached homes with enough privacy to conceal a prowler, but enough routine to make surveillance easy. Irrigation canals and greenbelts that offered dark travel lines, unfinished developments, and wide lots where one could move unseen before slipping back onto roads that led anywhere. The discovery of how geography cooperated with the crimes was one of the quieter but more important insights in the investigation. This offender did not simply choose people. He chose terrain. Community reaction also fed the discovery process. Though not always cleanly, once the media began reporting on similarities and once fear spread between neighborhoods, tips multiplied. Some were valuable. Many were not. Every suspicious stranger, every unfamiliar car, every memory of a man lurking near a school or canal now came filtered through collective dread. Detectives had to sort real pattern from rumor, and rumor can be as exhausting as silence in a long case. Yet communities also started protecting one another in ways that generated useful information. Neighbors watched more. Patrols increased. People reported prowlers more quickly. Women who might once have buried their terror in silence were more willing, though never easily, to speak to investigators. Men who had survived immobilized beside their partners added their own pieces to the developing portrait. The public was becoming part of the investigation, whether official channels could fully absorb that or not. Still, one of the bitterest truths of the discovery phase was that the offender often remained ahead of recognition. By the time one scene had been processed and one neighborhood warned, he could already be studying another. That lag is part of why the case became so mythic later. It was not simply that he escaped. It was that he repeatedly outran the moment in which the clues from one crime might have prevented the next, the murders. When they began to enter the pattern more clearly, forced a further transformation in the investigative response. A series once understood primarily through sexual assault and home invasion now carried the weight of homicide. The crime scenes changed accordingly. Death imposes a colder stillness. It also imposes a heavier evidentiary burden. Detectives entering those homes were no longer just trying to reconstruct terror. They were reconstructing finality. Blood patterns, body positions, signs of entry and restraint, missing items, interrupted domestic details. All of it had to be read not only for method, but for evolution. Was he the same man? Had the ritual changed? Was escalation visible in the environment? The answer, increasingly, was yes. The attacker had not abandoned his old language. He had expanded it. The familiarity of the home still mattered. The control still mattered. The use of nighttime surprise still mattered, but the ending had become more final. And that finality deepened the urgency of discovery, the initial clues. Then, were not one shining object or one confession waiting in plain sight. They were a constellation, biological evidence preserved even when technology had not caught up. Similar descriptions of movement, voice, command style, and behavior. Repeated use of domestic space as a control environment, prior prowling linked to later attacks. Geographic choices suggesting planning rather than randomness, stolen objects that seemed to mean more than property. And the lingering emotional signature left in survivors who had no reason to know one another yet seemed to be describing the same man-shaped pressure in the dark. Detectives began to compare notes across jurisdictions more seriously. The process was uneven because institutions are human, proud, busy, and often overburdened. But the pattern had become too strong to dismiss. There was, somewhere in California, an offender who was teaching the state to recognize him through repetition while denying it the one thing it needed most. His name. Perhaps the most haunting element of Part 5 is the moment when private violation becomes public pattern. A single survivor may feel isolated, cursed by one impossible night. But when cases begin to connect, the emotional meaning changes. The terror was not random. It was chosen, repeated, and portable. That realization can be both clarifying and devastating. Clarifying because it means the victims are not alone and not imagining the shape of what happened. Devastating because it means the man who entered one bedroom has likely entered others and may enter more. In that sense, the first real discovery in the Golden State Killer case was not forensic at all. It was the recognition that California was dealing with one offender whose crimes formed a moving system rather than isolated horrors. Everything after that. The evidence preservation, the composite sketches, the stakeouts, the interviews, the database, the future genetic breakthrough. Depended on that first terrible recognition. The scenes themselves had already said it. The windows, the bindings, the ransacked rooms, the repeated threats, the path through the yard, the violated marriages, the after-call on the phone, the way survivors described the same discipline in his cruelty. The houses were telling investigators that one man had turned ordinary neighborhoods into his map. It would take decades to force his name out of that map. But the discovery began there, in living rooms and bedrooms under the white morning light, where detectives stood over the wreckage of ordinary life and realized that the clues on the carpet, on the windowsill, in the victims' voices, and in the shape of fear itself were all pointing to the same impossible fact. Someone had been doing this again and again, learning from every house, and carrying the lessons onward into the next sleeping street. For years, the investigation into the man who would later be known as the Golden State Killer lived inside one of the most punishing conditions any case can endure. Everyone involved knew they were chasing something real, something organized, something intelligent and escalating. And yet, the closer they looked, the more the offender seemed to dissolve into distance. That is the cruel paradox at the center of Part 6. This was never a case ignored in the simple sense. Detectives cared, patrol officers warned neighborhoods, survivors spoke, evidence was gathered, reports were written, stakeouts were organized, sketches were distributed, and names for the offender began to circulate through newspapers and law enforcement briefings. But caring and catching are not the same thing. Between those two states lay years of fragmented jurisdiction, incomplete technology, changing methods, and the offender's own unnerving ability to learn faster than the system could unify around him. In one county, he was a prowler who had become a rapist. In another, a rapist who now looked like a killer. In another, perhaps only a rumor. A resemblance, a theory too large to fit neatly into the paperwork already stacked on desks. Every detective who worked one of those scenes could feel the pressure of repetition, but repetition alone was not yet enough to hand them a face. The suspect phase therefore began in a paradoxical landscape. There were too many possible men in California and only one actual offender. And for a long time, the investigation had no reliable way to close that distance. In Sacramento and the East area, fear built faster than proof. Investigators interviewed prowlers, burglars, drifters, sex offenders, angry ex-boyfriends, local men with violent histories, men whose cars had been seen idling where they should not have been, men with military backgrounds, men with police backgrounds, men who knew neighborhoods too well, men who knew women too well, men whose names surfaced because frightened communities start generating names as soon as the unknown begins to feel unbearable. Every composite sketch that reached the public created both opportunity and confusion. Someone always resembled the face, someone always had the wrong eyes, the wrong jaw, the wrong gait, the wrong timing, but just enough resemblance to pull detectives into another interview room. Tips came in from neighbors, former classmates, co-workers, estranged spouses, and people who were not really giving information so much as giving fear a local address. This is one of the least glamorous truths about major serial investigations. The public imagines a narrowing beam. In reality, there is often a flood first. A messy surge of half-memory, projection, personal grievance, and genuine instinct mixed together so thoroughly that detectives have to spend precious hours sorting pattern from panic. And while they sort, the offender is still out there. Breathing, moving, deciding. The Golden State Killer used that delay like a second weapon. What made the dead-end years so psychologically exhausting was that investigators were not working in darkness. They were working in broken light. They had descriptions of voice, movement, physical build, method, and behavior. They had neighborhoods mapped, timelines assembled, shoe impressions compared, statements cross-referenced, and growing confidence that multiple crimes belonged to one offender or at least one evolving criminal identity. They also had mounting evidence that the man was not simply opportunistic. He prepared. He prowled in advance. He selected homes with care. He adapted after publicity. He seemed to understand police response patterns, neighborhood vulnerabilities, and the emotional leverage of leaving survivors alive to spread fear. Those insights should have brought the case closer to resolution, but instead they often deepened the frustration. The clearer the offender's psychological outline became, the stranger it felt that no one could attach it securely to a name. He was too organized to be purely chaotic, too disciplined to be merely impulsive, too embedded in local geography to feel like a passing transient. Yet every time the investigation leaned hard toward one suspect, the case seemed to slide back into vapor. Alibis held, timelines failed, forensic comparisons stalled, and the shadow moved on. The regional fragmentation of California law enforcement during those years cannot be separated from the dead end. Separate departments carried their own cultures, priorities, and case pressures. A rape series in one county did not automatically synchronize with a homicide pattern in another. Information was shared, yes, but not with the seamless immediacy later generations assume. Officers still had to persuade one another, brief one another, and sometimes argue across invisible walls of jurisdictional pride or simple overload. A detective staring at a stack of violent cases in one county might feel in his bones that this offender belonged to a larger map, while another department farther south was still dealing with its own local urgencies under a different name for what might be the same man. Those naming differences mattered more than they should have. East Area Rapist, original Night Stalker, a prowler here, a burglar there, a rapist somewhere else. Names can help the public focus, but they can also trap investigations inside regional narratives. The offender benefited from every delay in recognizing that his story was one long line rather than several disconnected curves, and because he evolved, the confusion became even more useful to him. A burglar who becomes a rapist and a rapist who becomes a murderer can look like three offenders to institutions not yet built to think fluidly enough about escalation. As the years passed, the suspect pool shifted from too broad to strangely haunted. Certain types of men drew renewed attention again and again: former military personnel, men with police or security backgrounds, men known for prowling, for voyeurism, for sudden temper, for nocturnal habits, for an eerie familiarity with local neighborhoods. Investigators considered whether the offender might be married, might live with parents, might be a loner, might be someone able to hide in plain sight behind ordinary employment. Some survivors described physical traits that seemed broadly blue-collar: fit, compact, controlled. Some noted behavior that suggested prior experience with authority, discipline, or procedure. That last detail mattered. The offender often moved with the confidence of someone who understood how to give commands under pressure. He seemed to know how long he could stay and how quickly he had to disappear. He sometimes appeared to anticipate investigative logic. These were not definitive facts, but they pressed the case toward one especially chilling possibility. The man may have known policing from the inside. Yet even that possibility did not produce an arrest, because suspicion without the bridge of evidence is only a shape in the fog. The fog, in this case, lasted decades. There were moments when the investigation seemed close to breakthrough. Composite sketches sharpened, public awareness surged. Certain suspects were scrutinized intensely. Task forces pushed cooperation further. Advances in forensic science, especially the preservation and later comparison of biological evidence, gradually gave the case a backbone stronger than witness memory alone, but each advance was followed by the same hard fact. The offender still did not emerge. Detectives grew older with the case. Some retired carrying boxes, maps, and names that had once seemed promising and then failed to hold. Survivors built lives under the unfinished pressure of an absent answer. New investigators inherited old theories, some useful, some dead, some so often repeated they had hardened into lore without ever becoming proof. This is what the dead end really looked like, not inactivity. Attrition. The case kept living. But so did time, and time is both ally and enemy in investigations of this kind. It protects evidence if preserved well, yet it erodes memory, scatters witnesses, kills parents, changes addresses, breaks chains of ownership, and lets suspects age into seeming harmlessness. Joseph James DeAngelo spent those years in exactly that space. He was not myth while the victim suffered. He was a man living an ordinary-seeming life somewhere in California. Then in the larger American blur of aging adulthood, he worked, married, raised children, paid bills, mowed lawns, and accumulated the visual camouflage that old age eventually gives violent men. There is something almost unbearable in that contrast. Survivors were waking from nightmares and walking through marriages changed by terror, while the offender was grilling in a backyard, shopping for groceries, or blending into the social invisibility of middle-aged routine. That ordinary aging became part of the dead end. People imagine fugitives as visibly hunted, but this offender did not have to flee in dramatic ways. He only had to keep becoming more plausible as a normal citizen than as the predator still haunting unsolved case files. The suspect phase therefore evolved into a strange moral struggle between memory and appearances. Case files remembered, survivors remembered. Some detectives remembered with almost religious persistence, but appearances kept offering the world a different story. A neighbor, a retiree, a father, an old man. This is one reason the Golden State Killer case remained so corrosive in the public imagination. It was not only unsolved, it actively mocked the human tendency to believe age softens all men into harmlessness. During those long years, the investigation was also forced to confront one of the ugliest truths in serial crime. Not all victims receive equal institutional urgency. Early on, some survivors had been underestimated. Some neighborhoods had been slower to be linked, and some officials had not grasped how much trauma these crimes generated beyond the immediate physical acts. That misreading did not cause the case, but it fed the dead end. Whenever a victim's account is minimized, however subtly, an offender gains time. Whenever a jurisdiction treats its own case as an isolated aberration rather than a potential chapter in a larger narrative, an offender gains time. Whenever technology is not yet ready to extract the full power of preserved evidence, an offender gains time. DeAngelo's spree was built on many forms of time. The minutes he stole in houses, the weeks between attacks, the years between regions, the decades between offense and arrest. Investigators were always fighting clockwork that had already been wound by his earlier success, yet they did not stop. This matters. In the dead-end phase, persistence becomes its own kind of heroism, though not the dramatic kind cinema likes. It looks like evidence stored properly for a future science that does not yet exist. It looks like investigators refusing to throw away old theories even when careers are ending and budgets are narrowing. It looks like survivors granting another interview years later because the case may still live if they help keep it alive. It looks like detectives comparing old reports again, staring at the same patterns until their eyes ache, because some truth is present even if a name still is not. The Golden State Killer case survived its own dead ends because enough people refused to let it become legend instead of evidence. There were, inevitably, false crescendos. Suspects who seemed plausible enough to reignite hope, men who matched portions of the physical description or the behavioral profile. Men with ugly histories, proximity to crime scenes, police experience, burglary patterns, military discipline, or the right kind of menace in their backgrounds. Each time, the possibility rose and then thinned. A fingerprint mismatch, DNA exclusion once testing improved. A timeline inconsistency, no link to preserved evidence. The collapse of these leads had a special cruelty for survivors because each one briefly seemed like the end of waiting. Then the old uncertainty returned. In some cases, the offender's own silence became part of the dead end's mythology. He was not writing manifestos. He was not demanding attention in a flamboyant way that might expose him. He had, at least in appearance, withdrawn into normal life. That withdrawal made him harder to read and easier to underestimate. The most frightening predators are not always those who continue taunting the public. Sometimes they are the ones who simply stop, vanish into routine, and let the world exhaust itself chasing a younger version of a man who has already changed clothes, jobs, neighborhoods, and faces. D'Angelo appears to have done precisely that. He allowed time to age his disguise. By the early 21st century, the case had become both colder and hotter at once. Colder because the crimes belonged to an earlier era of California, to old subdivisions, old patrol cars, old news reports, and victims who had already carried the burden for too many years. Hotter because advances in DNA analysis and renewed public attention were making the impossibility feel less permanent. Investigators could now say with greater confidence that the same offender connected assaults and murders once separated by county lines and time. The biological evidence had survived. The man had left a